Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, I'll be speaking and also exploring an analysis of child labor trafficking arrest cases in the United States. That is part of a bigger study that we have published, something that Kristen touched base on earlier. So we were able to extract part of that data and look into the specific child labor trafficking cases from that study. The objectives for today will be exploring that the different requirements for child labor trafficking as well as the child sex trafficking, and provide an overview of the study. I also provide recommendation to increase research and awareness about forced child labor trafficking in the United States. To begin with, I've decided to skip all the definitions regarding labor trafficking because all these has been touched on already in the past 3 presentations. However, I wanted to continue with the child labor trafficking and child sex trafficking comparison. As we all know, that child sex trafficking under the federal definitions, it is illegal, as well as any child under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex do not need to have experienced forced fraud or coercion in order to be considered victims of severe form of trafficking in person. It is always sex trafficking when a person is under the age of 18. And that is entirely because children cannot consent to sex. As for child labor trafficking, children under the age of 18 in labor trafficking situation are subjected to higher legal standards and must have been subject to forced fraud or coercion in order to be considered labor trafficking victims. Child employment is permissible under certain circumstances, only becomes trafficking or exploitations when the employer uses forced fraud or coercion to control the child. The different requirement for the 2 types of trafficking may be related to the ability of children to work legally in the United States in certain situations, which we will explore in the next slices. Also, children can be victims of labor trafficking in both legal industries and illegal industries such as drug trade, and in legal industries such as agriculture. Video is taking a bit to load. I'm sorry, my internet is somewhat kind of acting up. But to actually summarize the video that's I was about to show, it explores the legal and illegal child labor that are in the United States conducted by illegal industry as well as legal industry. And by federal level, child labor trafficking practice protections are below international standards, especially in agricultural field. According to the International Labor Organization, ILO, defines child labor as work that deprives children of their childhood, potential, and dignity. And that is harmful of physical and mental development. So this includes any agricultural work that children are involved in, and agricultural work or any other industries where children are allowed to work, and they can potentially miss their schools as well as childhood development as well. State level policies can remedy these issues, but current patchwork is severely lacking. In the United States, children of any age may work in certain small exempt farms. Children can also, as young as 12, may work in non-residence farm jobs as well. We'll explore additional non-residence farms, non-residence employments in the next slides. Parental consents and school hours requirement apply to all of the above scenarios. Youth 16 and under, virtually no special protection compared to adults compared to adults. Fewer restrictions around hazardous job during school hours are also not required. The federal labor rules does not require minors to obtain work permits. It does not require minors to limit hours or restrictions time work for minors 16 years of age or older. It does not require breaks or meal periods for minors as well. So what are the non-hazardous work? We always hear about the hazardous work and non-hazardous work and where children are able to work and where they're not able to work. According to the Federal Labor Standards Act, car wash attendants are allowed for children to attend to those jobs as well. Retail sales and services, that's mean that children at any retail sales and services, as well as attending to cashiers at mom and pop shops are allowed. Community pools, lifeguards for children to work and gain life skills. Grocery baggers are allowed for children to attend to. Clerical workers, dishwashers, servers, golf attendants, as well as tutors are all works that are allowed for children to attend to. The hazardous work, according to the Federal Labor Standards Act, includes on or about roofing, all work in roofing operations, including work performed on the ground or in close proximity of the roof are not allowed by the federal government. Demolitions work are also not allowed as well. Pizza delivery are not allowed, or any form of requirement for children to operate a vehicle, a moving vehicle on the road is not allowed because minors are under the age of 17 may not drive on public roads as part of their job, according to the federal law. Chainsaws are not allowed as well. Meat sliders are not allowed because the operation of power-driven meat processing, much like operating a vehicle on public roads, such as meat slider saws, meat choppers, even if used on items other than the meats, are banned by the federal government's federal labor standards law. Excavations also are not allowed by the federal government. Scissor liftings, dough mixers, as you see the pattern of where this is headed. So all of these are hazardous jobs, hazardous works that are permitted, not permitted by the Federal Labor Standards Act. The FLSA provide minimum age of 18 years of any non-agricultural occupation, which the Secretary of Labor declares to be particularly hazardous for 16 and 17 years old, or any person under the age of 18. It also rules that these rules for child labor includes banning for all of these rules at any other places, including agricultural fields as well. So before we get to our study, I want to explore where labor trafficking takes place, and this includes adult labor trafficking as well as both child labor trafficking as well. Labor trafficking in the United States takes place, as you all heard in the past 3 presentations, in agricultural fields, in health and beauty services, factory and manufacturing, domestic workplaces where children are forced to work and in close-up areas, hotels and hospitality industry, restaurant and food industry, selling goods such as magazines, traveling sell cruise, and small businesses. With restaurant and food industry, children can work in the back as where they can wash dishes as well. And these places are a potential for where child labor trafficking take place as well. With hotels and hospitality industry as well, small businesses where kids may be working at a front desk as well as being cashiers. And at the end of the day, they are not able to receive any of that earning, or they're not paid for their hours as well. Child labor trafficking most often occurs in agricultural setting, factories, domestic works, and so forth. Today we're exploring the child labor trafficking study, as I mentioned earlier, which is an 8-year analysis of child labor trafficking cases in the United States. That is part of the broader study that we were doing at the ASU that I was part of. So the purpose of this study, the scope of work of the studies, is that while there have been modest improvement in data collection measures for child trafficking since the passage of the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, these efforts, however, are primarily focused on sex trafficking. We've heard this so many times, and in the past presentation and training that we all attend to, that child labor trafficking is not treated the same as child sex trafficking in the United States ever since the passage of this law. Efforts to estimate reliable statistics of the incidence and prevalence of child labor trafficking is difficult due to the criminal nature of the activities, lacking of uniform definitions among those collecting data, and the lack of a centralized database and under recognizing of victims. This is something that Kristen Abraham had just touched on not long ago, that these things are what's pulling us back from exploring and also understanding the difficulty of the nature of child labor trafficking. And we will explore some of the recommendations that we're providing for this from this study later on. This study uses a systemic search method to determine the risk for child labor trafficking of both U.S. citizen and foreign national in the United States, unlike the public's perception that labor trafficking only happens to foreign nationals. We find in these studies that labor trafficking happens to both foreign nationals and U.S. citizens as well, including homeless personnel and also runaways teenagers. So the purpose of the study is to gain insight into the factors that contribute to children becoming victims of child labor trafficking in the United States, explore the outcomes of arrest cases of labor traffickers of children, and trends of victims involving in these cases, as well as add to the literature regarding the vulnerabilities of migrants and domestic child labor trafficking exploited in the United States. So the methodology that we use, we collected data from numerous online search and categorized into variables in the SPSS database. This study then described the findings from the case collected. This study was approved by the Arizona State University Institutional Review Board, focused on criminal cases of persons arrested for child labor trafficking, defined as individuals found to be recruited, contractors, employers, and other who use violence, threats, lies, debt bondage, or other including forced labor, forced child labor, human trafficking, harboring of aliens, employments, evasion, tax evasion, as well as harboring of aliens for illegal means of gaining economic opportunities. The study for this took 2 steps while we were doing this. We took a broader search on a web-based media reports for any reports that were sent out or published via media on our public medias and also governmental medias as well. That was the first step for this search. We also took the second step as a targeted review of electronically filed court documents and governmental reports. 4 cases were not included in this study because once the documents were reviewed and they were determined that they were for human smuggling only. We found that in some cases where some of these news media, they would describe a situation where a trafficker or smuggler is bringing up to 12 to 29 individuals to the United States through the border, and there's no signs of human trafficking, but however, there are a lot of signs of human smuggling. So media often confuses human trafficking and human smuggling, and also charging smugglers with trafficking charges. Finding for this study, we found 34 cross-sectional child labor trafficking criminal cases from the years 2011 to 2018. The trafficking type for this study include nearly 3/4 of the cases were for child labor trafficking cases only, and more than 1/4 of the cases were for both child sex trafficking and child labor trafficking. We found in some cases where, such as sexualized labor, such as massage parlors, where children would also be used to actually be at the front office to actually welcome guests, but also be used at the back to actually give certain acts of sexual acts as well. In these cases, child labor trafficking and child sex trafficking cross over each other because children in these places are not paid. Of these cases, we found that in 13 states in the United States had documented arrests for child labor trafficking over the 8 years, including Texas at the top for nine arrests, Wisconsin followed by 5 arrests, Ohio followed by 3 arrests, North Carolina were 3 as well, California, Michigan, Minnesota, and Missouri, as well as New York, all at 2 arrests each. Florida, Kansas, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, all at 1 arrest each. This is a map of the findings where we found reported arrests of labor trafficking, child labor trafficking in the United States across the 8 years report. Right. The child labor trafficking venues includes some trafficking venues were used for dual purposes and where victims was both harbored and also exploited, and we will exploit these venues as well. Traffickers use houses where they would actually force children to do laundry, to clean the houses, as well as cooking for family members. At the same time, they were harboring children and also housing them, giving them places to stay, and in some cases sleeping on the floor, some cases with no blankets, especially during times when once it's really cold. So these places were used for dual purposes. Hospitality industry, hotels and spas were also used as dual purposes as well, where children were exploited. And also, they were also housed at. Streets were used by exploiters only for panhandling purposes and street vendors, where traffickers would send kids out to be panhandling, asking for money or asking for anything of value to act in those places. And once kids actually return home or return to the trafficker, they would not be compensated for their time standing there in those places, especially if during times when schools are closed in the weekend, children can actually stand in those streets for up to 12 hours as well, and they're not compensated for any of that any of their labor. Traffickers' apartment were also used as dual purposes, where also kids were exploited to actually clean as well as do laundry. Group homes and home healthcare were also used as places where children were exploited, as well as agricultural fields. So the law enforcement officer were able to use a variety of strategies to identify child labor trafficking situations and arresting child labor traffickers. They were able to identify child labor traffickers due to responding to specific requests from individuals or groups in the community that involve in immediate response to call and follow up investigations. Some of these cases, 12 cases, 12 of these cases were identified after victims asked for help, and also the anonymous person would also then go and to report to law enforcement. 9 of these cases were reported by a person in position of authority, healthcare workers, social workers, as well as those in educational sectors. 3 of these cases were tip off from an anonymous caller. 3 of these cases were investigation for other illegal activities, such as immigration sweeps and other means of illegal activities, such as drugs activities. 2 cases were identified after suspicious advertisement by law enforcement, and some of these cases were identified way before websites such as Backpage.com was shut down in 2018. 2 of the cases were identified through immigration sweep and sting. 1 case was identified through traffic car stops. 1 case was identified through a proactive investigation where a trafficker was identified by law enforcement who actually took training before going onto the street and make this part of his job. Key findings, the primary traffickers, gender-wise, 24 of the traffickers were male traffickers, 10 traffickers were female traffickers. Ethnicity, we found that four of the traffickers were Pacific Islanders, 7 of the traffickers were Caucasians, 12 of the traffickers were African Americans, and 10 traffickers were Hispanics and Latinas. Key findings, the primary traffickers, we found that for their citizenships, of those 29 individuals, we actually disclosed the citizenship. 14 of the cases were Americans, US-born citizens. 31% were undocumented immigrants. 13.8% of the cases were naturalized US citizens. And 3.4% of the cases were non-citizen with a visa, who actually brought the victims to the United States with them. 3.4% of the cases were lawful permanent resident traffickers. Occupations for traffickers were given in 20 of the cases through news articles. 5 of the cases involve agriculture sector personnel. 4 of the cases involve a trafficker who was in education sector. 3 of the cases involve a person who was in the restaurant sector. 2 of the cases involve a person who worked in the hospitality and hotel industry. 2 of the cases involve in-home healthcare. 1 of the cases constructions, 1 case authority figures, police and military. One of the cases was a transportation sectors, and 1 cases was other. Key findings for the victims, we explore victims' identity. For the 34 cases, we found that in 52.9% of the cases involve a minor victims only. We also found that 47.1% of the cases involve a trafficker who trafficked both minors victims and adult victims. Gender-wise, we found that in 27 cases, there were 17 female victims. In 8 cases, there were male victims, and 2 cases there were transgender victims. Age ranges from ages 8 to 17 years old, and average of 15 years of age. Key finding for victims' relationship to trafficker, we found in 32 cases that 18 of the cases involve victims in a trafficker relationship, which was an acquaintance. 11 cases were complete, 11 traffickers were complete strangers to their victims. One was a friend, 1 was a romantic partner, 1 was a family member. And the victims' origins were given in 34 cases. 58 of the 34 cases had victims who originated from another country other than the United States. And of those cases, 41 of those had victims who was either a US citizen or permanent resident of the United States. Key findings, tools, recruitment tools used by traffickers. Traffickers use a number of channels where they use staffing agencies, online advertisements, emails and phone calls, Backpage, including Backpage and word of mouth. Of the three cases that involve word of mouth were of a trafficking case that was of a trafficker who actually went overseas to actually advertise a job in the United States, promising some of the villagers that if you give me your children, I will actually be able to employ them. And after the employment, I'll put them in schools, they will get educated, and during the employment, they will send money back to you. And this way that they're able to provide for you. I'm not able to take adults with me, and I will only take children. And one of the reasons that he actually recruited children was because he deemed them being more easily controlled. So key findings for recruitment and control tactics, we found that for false and fraud incursion, 41.2% of the cases involve physical violence through victims, toward victims. 14.7% of the cases involve a trafficker who actually sexually abused the victim. Frauds includes offering a victim a place to stay with no true intention, promising money or wealth, tricking a victim into thinking that they would be doing another job such as babysitting or any other means of employments, and then turning the victim into working at other means of employment such as farms, egg farms, as well as working at massage parlors. When examining these child labor trafficker, they use job position to recruit and exploit victims, such as owner of roofing company, restaurant owners, and school employees. Coercion was also examined. It was 94% of the cases use threats of harm or psychological violence towards the victims. 23% of the cases were cases where a trafficker threatened to report the victims to the immigration authority as a means of controlling the victim and also putting fear on the victims. If you don't actually conduct certain job for me, I will report you, and also the immigration authority will actually deport you. 20% of the cases found that a trafficker withheld a victim's passport. So transportation was also explored in these cases, and traffickers use multiple form of transportation, including auto, including buses, trucks, airplanes, and trains, to move their victims to up to eight separate states within the United States. 50% of the cases involve a trafficker who cross national borders from 6 different countries with their victims. 76% of the cases involve a trafficker who actually brought their victims from Mexico or Central America. 58.8% of the cases of the trafficker bought tickets for travels and other means of recruitment. And 51% of the cases of the traffickers cross state line with their victims. All right, case study. On January 21st, 2011, Lucinda Shackle, 53 years of age, was indicted by the federal grand jury in the Western District of North Carolina on charges of forced labor and domestic servitude following an investigation by the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and Homeland Security investigations. According to the indictment, the underage undocumented male victims at the time age 16 was has been living under the care of Shaka Ford for from June 2009 through a contract with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Family Reunification Program, with the promise that the trafficker would provide, among other things, proper living conditions, food, and clothing. As per the agreement, the trafficker and the family reunification under no circumstances was the victims expected to engage in any work activities and was allowed to have scheduled weekly visit with his father. Instead, the trafficker forced the victims to engage in various type of exploitative child labor without being paid, withholding the victim's birth certificate, and not providing the victims with adequate food, restricting the victim's movement, and denying the victims the visitation right to go visit his father. The trafficker then went further to threaten the victims to report the victims into law enforcement authority and immigration official if the victims did not continue to work for her against his will, and ordering the victims to give all of their earned money to the trafficker. The trafficker was charged with one count of forced labor, which carries a maximum of sentence of 20 years in imprisonment and a fine of up to $250,000, and one count of domestic substitute, which carries a maximum of 5 years in prison and a fine of $250,000. So the prosecution and case resolution was explored in these cases. We found that in more than 73% of the cases, there were trials, and most of the cases were prosecuted by federal court. 58.8% of the cases were investigated by Homeland Security investigation, and 41.2% of the cases were investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Case resolution was provided and also found in 29 of the cases. We found in 62.1% of the cases showed that traffickers took a plea agreement. 20.7% of the cases of the trafficker found not guilty. 17.2% of the traffickers were no contender, and 35.3% of the cases had a child labor trafficker who were ordered to pay restitution ranging from $5,600 to a maximum of $212,000. All right. Implications for this study. We explored this earlier, that we need to do more in research, and also we need to improve victim benefits and compensations for child labor trafficking as compared to child sex trafficking, and also providing person-centered and trauma-informed services. But what does this really look like in academia? It's also in research. This study has illustrated that child trafficking occurs in the United States, and it's imperative to understand the scope and the complex nature of child labor trafficking of minor, so that services can be available for this population, and necessary allocation of federal and state funds for services can be made to assist the minor labor trafficking victims. Different from child sex trafficking situation of minor forced to work in restaurant, agricultural fields, and farms as domestic servants, or the hospitality industry, may not show red flags from an outsider's observer as compared to a child exchanging sexual services. In this way, that a child can work a front desk as a cashier, where you wouldn't even actually think about that this child is potentially a labor trafficking victims, because in the United States, as explored earlier, children are allowed to work under certain circumstances. Community-based awareness about the crime of child labor trafficking can foster public pressure on companies, on the private sector and individuals to take responsibility in identifying children working and being exploited in the United States. And also additionally, better data collections and more research is needed in this line of work as regard to child labor trafficking. This study also shows that 26.5% of the cases analyzed involve both child labor trafficking and child sex trafficking minors. The child sex labor trafficking victims in this study were found to suffer greater psychological abuse as well as sexual abuse at the hands of their traffickers. They may require extensive services and compensation. However, many states have laws that are unfair to the victims in terms of claiming victims' benefit and compensation. For instance, in the state of Arizona, particularly where the Office of Sex Trafficking Prevention is at, and also where this symposium is based, labor trafficking victims must be classified by the government as an individual who was recruited, however, for labor or services by force, fraud, or coercion, for subjection to involuntary substitute, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. The term labor trafficking is generally understood to mean work that is done by a worker in the absence of free contract between himself and the employer. We learned from earlier the first presentation that Kristen Bracey was presenting on, that labor trafficking and labor exploitations can mean two different things. However, they both also overlap, where victims can be exploited under legal employments. They're not being allowed to leave, and their wages can be cut short, as well as working under substandard living conditions as well. So this is a major loophole when assisting labor trafficking victims, because states should introduce new victims, a new law, as well as victim-friendly laws that will allow children exploited in labor to actually have easy access to services and compensation as well. Lastly, providing personal center and trauma-informed services to victims of labor trafficking is essential to meeting their needs by offering opportunities for personal, educational, as well as economic advancement. These support services can help stabilize the victims. Victims can become economically and personally independent when they obtain an education, gain new job skills, develop life and social skills, also learn a new language if needed, and as well as obtain employment. Service providers that focus on person-centered responses are also encouraged to collaborate with agencies that are credible, trauma-informed, and also who are familiar with the complex nature of labor trafficking, as well as immigration laws for victims who are foreign nationals. Trauma-informed personnel are trained in the effects of trauma on individuals and are sensitive to unique nature of trauma survivors. So these are some of the implementation that we came up with based on the study, as well as based on previous studies that have been done prior to this study on child labor trafficking. And we think that this work is something that should be looked to in-depthly, and also should be taken seriously by those who may come in contact with child labor trafficking, including law enforcement, healthcare workers, as well as educational personnel, those in high school and middle schools as well. So potential immigration remedies, we wanted to throw this out there for anyone who's working, who might come across a case where they're working with a child labor trafficking victims who might be foreign nationals. The U.S. government actually offer asylum for individuals trafficked through threats that form basis of well-funded fear. It's a different defense to removal. Also, they offer special immigration juvenile status for unaccompanied minors due to abuse, neglect, or abandonment. They also offer humanitarian relief for children and family members prior to filing for T visa, the trafficking visa. So these are some of the immigration remedies that we are actually suggesting for any agencies or anyone out there who might be a lawyer and working on a child labor trafficking case to look into these cases as well. Because under some laws, individuals who have been exploited and also who've been trafficked and are foreign nationals, they are actually required to stay in the United States in order for them to actually have a T visa, and also for them to actually follow up with cases and for case to be forwarded to prosecutor and for traffickers to be trial in court. So it's important to actually keep these remedies in mind when you are actually working on labor trafficking case. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today on this panel. I hope you took a great deal of knowledge on this today. Thank you.